Welcome to episode 43 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this edition of the podcast, we're going to discuss, is Donovan McNabb a Hall of Famer? Some perspective on the season finales of shows like The Flash, Supergirl, and Arrow, what it means to the future of the Arrowverse. Is Steph Curry one of the greatest point guards in NBA history? So let's open up a cold one and get started on episode 43 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Topic number one on this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. It's been circulated everywhere. You've heard the comments. Donovan McNabb told TMZ Sports that he believes he should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And the problem with his argument is not that he's right or wrong. It's the fact of how he went about doing so. One of the problems for Donovan McNabb is that people have a perception of him, and because that perception is stronger than the reality that actually what happened in his career, people tend to treat him a certain way. There is a contingent of Eagle fans who hated the draft pick back in 1999. They blame him for anything and everything they possibly can during his tenure, when the truth is that Donovan McNabb is responsible for one of the greatest and most successful eras in Eagles franchise history. He's arguably the best quarterback in Eagles franchise history, at least statistically. He may not be the most endearing or the most beloved, but he is certainly fundamentally the most impactful quarterback on winning wise in franchise history. Now, just because you're one of the best in your franchise history doesn't mean that you are a Pro Football Hall of Famer. The mistake McNabb has made whenever it has been brought up about him being a Hall of Famer is he always brings up the fact that he believes that he put up better numbers statistically than Troy Aikman. He has brought up the fact that he thinks that he is a better quarterback than even Eli Manning. Now, he gives Eli the credit for winning 2 Super Bowls, but the problem with this argument is that stats are the greatest lie in sports. In football, unlike baseball, stats only tell a small portion of the story. Donovan says that he has better stats than Aikman. Well, did you know that Donovan McNabb has 24 touchdowns and 17 interceptions in the postseason? Troy Aikman has 23 touchdowns and 17 interceptions in the postseason. They're almost identical, but yet Aikman is 11-4 in the postseason with 3 Super Bowl rings, and McNabb is 9-7 with 1 Super Bowl appearance. You can find a stat anywhere that make one person look better than the other. Donovan McNabb has fewer yards per attempt in the postseason than Hall of Famer Bart Starr. And Bart Starr played in the 1960s in an era where they barely passed the ball as much as they do today. In fact, Bart Starr has, for his entire postseason career, 213 pass attempts. Donovan McNabb had 216 pass attempts in his rookie season. It's a different world, folks. Just using stats is not a good enough barometer to measure who is the better quarterback. Yeah, McNabb, you do have more passing yards than Aikman. You know who else has more passing yards than Troy Aikman? Phil Simms. He's not in the Hall of Fame. In fact, let me name you some quarterbacks with more passing yards than Donovan McNabb who are not in the Hall of Fame. Boomer Esiason, Dave Craig, Kerry Collins, Drew Bledsoe, Vinny Testaverde, and Carson Palmer. Most people, if they're being 100% objective, would take Donovan McNabb as their starting quarterback over Carson Palmer, Vinny Testaverde, Kerry Collins, and Dave Craig all in their prime. Boomer's a former NFL MVP, so maybe you would take Boomer over Donovan McNabb. And it's a coin flip if you would rather have Bledsoe or McNabb. If you have a bad offensive line, maybe you want McNabb running around. If you have a good offensive line, maybe you want Bledsoe in his prime. Personal preference. I'm not here judging. The fact of the matter is that stats don't tell the whole story. When you look at the list of all the quarterbacks who are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, it's a list of quarterbacks who have almost nothing in common. They're not all there because of their stats, or because of Super Bowl championships, or playoff wins, or how many times they led the league in completion percentage, or how many league MVPs that they got in their careers. In fact, when you look at some of the quarterbacks in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, sometimes you wonder, how exactly is said guy in the Hall of Fame? For example, quarterbacks like Bob Greasy were never among the best statistical quarterbacks, and you could argue that they're only there because their teams were so successful. Joe Namath is another guy. The guy has more interceptions than touchdowns in his career. So stats didn't put them there. What put them there? The Pro Football Hall of Fame at the end of the day is a museum. It tells the history of the game. To me, the two things that put every quarterback in the Pro Football Hall of Fame is, one, were you a part of the history of the game? Can we tell the game's history without you? Number two, were you among the best of the best at your position during your era? That really seems to be the greater prerequisite for the Pro Football Hall of Fame than anything else. Baseball is a game of stats. Your stats put you in the Hall of Fame more often than not. You get credit for putting up big numbers. In football, like I said, there are numerous quarterbacks with a lot of passing yards who will never get into the Hall of Fame. And it's nothing against Carson Palmer, Vinny Testaverde, Drew Bledsoe, Kerry Collins, Dave Craig, Boomer Esiason, Matt Hasselbeck, Jim Everett, Jim Hart, Steve DeBerg, Tony Romo, John Hadle, and Phil Simms. All of these guys have better passing yard numbers than Troy Aikman and Steve Young and others who are in the Hall of Fame, but their careers didn't have the same impact on the game of football, on the history of the sport that the Hall of Famers do. So where does that leave McNabb? His argument should be to say, during my career, I was one of the best in my era. Well, what is McNabb's era? 1999 to 2010 is basically the era of his quarterbacking tenure. When you think about that era of quarterbacking, who were the best quarterbacks? Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Drew Brees. I think most people would agree those are all Hall of Fame quarterbacks. Those are all guys who are not just among the best of their era, but among the best all time, possibly. You can't make a conversation about quarterbacks in 2019 without mentioning Manny, Brady, and Brees. It's just the big picture. So when you look at the era, who is after those three? Well, you have Donovan McNabb, sure. But you also had Steve McNair, Mark Brunell, Roethlisberger, Eli Manning, and Phillip Rivers were all drafted in 2004. So they get at least half of the era that Donovan McNabb occupied. Matt Hasselbeck also has to be considered. He led the Seattle Seahawks to a Super Bowl in the mid-2000s. Also, Kurt Warner. Kurt Warner's era was basically the same era, 1999 to 2010. Kurt Warner's already in the Hall of Fame, so we kind of can already say that he is among the best of his era, at least according to the voters for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So where does that leave McNabb? During his era was also Drew Bledsoe, Carson Palmer. Carson Palmer's career was 2004 to 2017, so he did play beyond McNabb's era, just like Roethlisberger, Eli Manning, and Phillip Rivers. Kerry Collins was 1995 to 2011, so he and McNabb overlapped when it came to their careers. Tony Romo was roughly about 2005 to 2015, so he kind of overlapped McNabb's era as well. So there's a lot of quarterbacks in this conversation who were part of McNabb's era, but maybe were not at their best during that 10-year period where McNabb was the franchise quarterback for the Philadelphia Eagles. So I ask you, of all the quarterbacks I named, outside of Breeze, Manning, Brady, and Warner, is there a quarterback who is better during his era than Donovan McNabb? If you don't believe that Steve McNair, Matt Hasselbeck, and those type of quarterbacks, Mark Brunell, Jake Delhomme of the Panthers, Chad Pennington of the Jets, if you do not believe that those quarterbacks are better than Donovan McNabb, then the argument can be made that Donovan McNabb should be in the conversation for the Hall of Fame. The problem with the Hall of Fame conversation is that everyone has a different set of criteria measuring who should or shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. That is where it gets messy. Some people believe that stats are more important. Some people believe that rings and championships are more important. Some people believe that wins and losses, completion percentage. I would say that they all should be factored in. One item is not more important than the other. Because the problem with stats, a lot of it has to do with right place and right time. Unless you're among the greatest to ever live, like Dan Marino and Tom Brady, it almost doesn't matter who your teammates are. You're still going to put up great stats and you're still going to have success in the NFL. Whereas if you're a guy like Terry Bradshaw, most people would agree that Bradshaw, without his Hall of Fame teammates, is probably not himself in the Hall of Fame. The same goes for Troy Aikman. So where does that leave McNabb? McNabb spent most of his career without elite talent around him on offense. Outside of the 1 year with Terrell Owens, he never played with an elite wide receiver. His best tight ends were Chad Lewis and L.J. Smith. For as talented and as beloved as Brian Westbrook is, most of us would agree that he is not on the same level as the running backs that other Hall of Fame quarterbacks from the same era played with. Most people would agree that Marshall Faulk is better than Brian Westbrook. He played with Kurt Warner. Most people would agree that Edgerrin James is a better running back than Brian Westbrook. He played with Peyton Manning. Drew Brees got to play a short time with LaDainian Tomlinson. So did Phillip Rivers. LaDainian Tomlinson is arguably one of the 5 greatest running backs of all time. So for as great as Westbrook was, he is not as high level in most people's minds as the other running backs who play with the other Hall of Fame quarterbacks. So where does that leave McNabb? Where that leaves McNabb is the fact that he still had success without elite offensive weapons. Sure, he did not ever win the Super Bowl, but neither did Marino. Sure, he only made 1 Super Bowl appearance. Warren Moon never reached the Super Bowl. In fact, the list of quarterbacks who are in the Hall of Fame who never won the Super Bowl is actually longer than you would think. Dan Marino, Warren Moon, Fran Tarkenton, Dan Fouts, all of them never won a Super Bowl. Jim Kelly never won a Super Bowl. Got to 4 of them, but didn't win it. So where does that leave McNabb in the Hall of Fame conversation? I leave you with this question. If you cannot find a quarterback whose names are not Brady, Manning, Breeze, and Warner, who are better than McNabb during his era of quarterbacking, if you genuinely believe that Matt Hasselbeck or Steve McNair or Kerry Collins or Carson Palmer or Drew Bledsoe, if you believe that any of the quarterbacks who are not the big 4 are better than McNabb, then McNabb should not be in the Hall of Fame. But if you deep down in your soul know that McNabb is better than all the other quarterbacks who are not the big 4 of his era, if McNabb is genuinely the 5th best quarterback in his era, then he should be in the Hall of Fame. That is the case for and against McNabb, not the stats. The argument for how his stats stack up against other Hall of Famers is a manipulative and subjective conversation. We can find numbers for and against anybody. The bigger question is, what is McNabb's place in the history of the game of football? And for the people who hate McNabb, they don't want to admit that McNabb was the franchise quarterback of the Philadelphia Eagles for a decade, and he was a major catalyst in them getting the 5 NFC championship games as well as a Super Bowl appearance. And the people who support Donovan McNabb overlook the fact that there are numerous quarterbacks with better stats than he has. So the bigger question is, again, what is McNabb's standing in league history? When you answer that question objectively and take your emotions out of it, then you will have the answer of if he is genuinely a Hall of Famer. Topic number 2 on episode 43 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I want to give you a encapsulated recap of the CW shows that we track here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Over the last year, you've heard me give you detailed information about how the ratings have done, audience reception of different shows, and the futures of these shows on the CW. And part of the reason why we have this conversation, again, is because of the fact that the precursor for the CW, when it comes to their shows, was Smallville. And Smallville was a show that was on the air for 10 years. So you have a network whose history is with a superhero show that is one of the second longest running shows on their network ever. And now you have the Arrow. Next season will be their final season. The Flash is having success year after year. Supergirl has had a rough go in the ratings. Black Lightning is new on the ratings seat. DC Legends of Tomorrow has also been renewed, but has had rocky ratings as well. At the end of the day, it's more than just ratings when it comes to a lot of these shows. For shows like The Flash, it is obvious they are the powerhouse of CW when it comes to regular viewers, episode in each week's episode, or is this just the digital and the playbacks? The Flash is the most popular show on the CW, hands down. When it comes to the shows like Supergirl, Arrow, Black Lightning, and DC Legends of Tomorrow, while they've all been renewed for one more season, Arrow's next season will be its final season. The other shows have agreements, at least for a full order of a season. The belief is that the CW is investing very heavily in the superhero genre. And it's more than just because of their association with the W in their name, which is WB, which is the affiliate company and distributor of DC Comics, movies, TV shows, and animated programming. It is also because of the fact that they have found an audience that is interested in consuming this content, no matter how related or unrelated some of that content may be to its comic origins. In the season finale of both The Flash, The Arrow, Supergirl, and DC Legends of Tomorrow were little cues for you into what is coming next season and why they are all interconnected, and that is the Monitor. We saw that the Monitor, who is a multiversal deistic character in the DC universe, made an appearance at the end of each season. When it came to Supergirl, he brought in Martian Manhunter's brother, and he made an appearance at the dead body of Lex Luthor. At the end of Arrow, the Monitor comes to collect on Oliver Queen's agreement with him to help him save the multiverse and stop an upcoming crisis. At the end of The Flash, that we saw that the calendar that predicts the Flash's disappearance changed drastically from a date several years down the road to an upcoming month in 2019 is when the Flash ultimately disappears. We saw at the end of DC Legends of Tomorrow, the Monitor was observing, watching, and in some ways disapproving of how the Legends went about saving the world from Necron bringing hell on Earth. In every case at the end of these seasons, we understand that the CW and their producers are working toward a very large consolidation of what we know is the Arrowverse in a major event that is not just going to wrap up Oliver Queen's story arc when it comes to the CW network, but it's also going to wrap up what we know of as this version of the CW when it comes to this style of storytelling. The CW has gotten more and more experimental when it comes to the shows that are not the Flash and the Arrow, because I think that in their minds, they're trying to keep viewers watching. They're trying to keep viewers interested. And I think some of their attempts have succeeded and others have failed. While Black Lightning is not part of the greater Arrow universe, the show Black Lightning has done a good job at regaining traction and finding its place in the what makes the show valuable, which is, whether you like or dislike Black Lightning is a show that's built around family. It's a very family-centric story that is going on that's built around the Jeffersons, the father, the mother, and the two daughters. When it comes to a show like The Flash, it is very hard cemented into what it is. It's about family, it's about the relationships of the characters, and it's about a character in The Flash who has always been an integral part of the DC universe. And Arrow is basically the forerunner of all of these shows in this current iteration. It's the show that introduced Oliver Queen. It's the show that basically set up The Flash and DC Legends of Tomorrow to even come about. And next season will be the final season of the Arrow show. And even the Arrow showed that they are able to resuscitate themselves. Remember, it was the same Arrow show that got a new showrunner, new writers, and new people on board when it came to the writing of this season. And the actor himself, Stephen Amell, came out and said, "We are treating this year like it may be our last," which was probably the best idea, because now, after 7 seasons, the show has pretty much run its course, and I think that they've exhausted a lot of the original ideas and content when it came to that show. And while the show overall trended better in the 18 to 49 demo than it did last year, it did rebuild its viewership in certain ways. By the end of the season, the show had pretty much lost a lot of momentum. And part of that is because only the diehards of the show were really watching. The casual viewers had really lost interest since the crossover event back in December. You look at the numbers from the mid-season finale, which was December 10th, to the season finale, which was May 13th, you see that on December 10th, which was right around the end of the Major Crisis event, they had over 2 million viewers on cable television. Whereas at the end of the season, they couldn't break that same million viewers mark. That's a huge dip in viewership. You go from over 2 million to under 1 million. That's a drastic dip. What does that tell you? That tells you that the show is still doing well with the diehard viewers. The show is still one of the higher ranked CW shows on the year. It is actually in their end of season top 5. The show, average week to week, did better than many other shows on the CW, not just on the Nielsen ratings, but in audience receptions on digital platforms and audience reception in general. Arrow still did better than Black Lightning, DC Legends of Tomorrow, Roswell, The 100, Charmed, and other shows on the network. And now the CW is going to introduce Batwoman into basically filling the void of a non-superpowered vigilante in the DC universe. It's another example of how the CW is really trying to experiment with potential viewership. And I think that Arrow is basically going to use Batwoman to tap into what they hope is a growing Supergirl viewership. Now, Supergirl is a show that you've heard me be hypercritical of extensively over time. And part of it has to do with the fact that I've been majorly critical of the dishonesty of the show's writers and producers about the intent of the show versus what it has evolved into. I don't need numbers to tell me that the show and their audiences have really grown apart. When the show started, it was on one of the biggest networks on television, CBS. initially, despite the hokiness and the slapstick humor and in some ways cotton candy style of the show, it was received well and initially had built a viewership that was invested in the show. And as seasons progressed, the show got away from the first season. Now, maybe in their own minds, they thought they were building character depth and they were expanding the story and the universe. But realistically, they were getting away from the show's original intent. The show's original intent was supposed to be a superhero show for women with female heroes and a female-centric cast. In many ways, they've evolved that concept into basically becoming a platform for a very progressive and social agenda at times, and a show that realistically has made Supergirl look weak at times to her audience. When you're trying to make a show that is supposed to be a role model, it's a show that is barely surviving in terms of television and digital ratings. Audience ratings have dipped majorly up until recently. And when it comes to viewership, the show has taken major hits in viewership. It has gotten so poor when it comes to viewership. This was the first season in Supergirl's 4 years on television that it had an episode that had less than 1 million viewers. While for some shows that may not be a big deal, that is a major drop for a show that in its second season averaged 2.35 million viewers per episode, and at the time was ranked as one of the highest viewed shows behind Arrow and The Flash on the CW. But since that second season, the show has regressed in viewership and interest in the show. Now, as you've heard me say right here on the Mutant Blitz podcast, the introduction of Lex Luthor has in some ways helped revitalize interest in the show. For the last few weeks of the show, they had some very, very solid, consistent ratings. For the final 4 episodes of the show averaged right around 1.2 million viewers per show, an average that outpaced the previous 6 episodes of the show. In fact, the Supergirl show, while it peaked during the Crisis crossover like the Arrow show did, it was unable to hold that high level of viewership for the rest of its season. And as I mentioned, it did dip at one point under 1 million viewers. And part of the dips for Supergirl can be directly associated with the fact that these major gaps in the CW schedule. And I'm not going to sit here and tell the CW what they should or shouldn't do, but I can tell you that the numbers show that when they have gaps in weeks between episodes, whether it's from March 31st to April 21st, or from February 17th to March 3rd, or the mid-season finale December 11th to January 20th, the drops in viewership from each of those dates to the next is very significant, and it shows that the show builds momentum and then very quickly loses that said momentum. So maybe one of the goals for the CW next year is to have less gaps of time in between episodes. And when they gain viewership, when they build up to a viewership number, they should try to maybe get rid of some of those gaps in the schedule. And maybe with the Arrow going off television at the end of 2019, maybe 2020, we'll see a more consistent schedule from the CW for all their shows, not just Supergirl, but for DC Legends of Tomorrow, for The Flash, and for the upcoming Batwoman show. DC Legends of Tomorrow, they didn't have as many gaps in their schedule, mostly because of the fact that they only had one big gap. From December 10th to April 1st, there were no episodes of DC Legends of Tomorrow. Interestingly enough, they were very consistent, though, from that April 1st to the end of the season, May 20th. They averaged just under 1 million viewers per episode, apexing at over 1 million viewers for the final episode, which is actually on par with what they did back on December 10th. So even with the gap, the show is very consistent in its viewership. I think one of the reasons why this show is going to survive, though, is because they are doing some reshuffling of the cast and doing some reshuffling of the story. And part of that has to do with the upcoming major crisis event that involves the Arrow show. I think that, as I've said before, the DC Legends of Tomorrow show and Supergirl do not have long-term viability because their experimentation with the show, with the cast, and with the stories is getting to a point where it's might be getting hard for audiences to stay on board. I did like the fact they took the risk in bringing in a John Constantine into the show and started delving into the John Constantine aspects of the DC mythology. I thought that was a worthwhile risk, especially considering John Constantine and his popularity with certain viewers. But again, the CW suffered the same problem with DC Legends of Tomorrow. They suffered with Supergirl. When there was this huge gap, there was a huge drop in viewership. When you lose almost 40% of your viewership during a gap, in the case of DC Legends of Tomorrow, or in the case of Supergirl, that had a drop of, ready for this, 64% during their biggest gap, that tells me that when it comes to the non-diehard viewer, which we would refer to as the casual viewer, the CW has made a major miscalculation in terms of these shows, and they're not doing a very good job at maintaining viewership across the board when it comes to episodes. Now, I understand that the digital numbers for some of these shows are much better than the Nielsen numbers, but the Nielsen numbers are very stark and very drastic when it comes to these shows. Whereas The Flash, you don't see as hard of a dip up and down when it comes to their viewership. You may see small movement when it comes to the show, but overall the show has been extremely consistent and has been strongly at the number one slot for the CW for a few seasons now. It's not like The Flash now in his 5th season has seen any major hits or major dips in the show. No, they've consistently been there. They've consistently been in the conversation and they've been consistently watched. So I think the goal for the CW, while they're trying to be experimental in terms of Supergirl, in terms of bringing Batwoman into this universe, and in terms of these other characters, I understand what they're trying to do. And I actually enjoy some of the stuff they are doing, like I said, with DC Legends of Tomorrow. Look, it's goofy and it's hokey, and in some ways it's a little whacked, but I enjoy it. It's a very comic book campy style of programming. When it comes to Supergirl, I've told you before, I think Supergirl lost their way, and they got a little bit better and more substantive toward the end of the season when they introduced Lex Luthor and really solidified and strengthened the content of the show. And maybe the implementation of this major crisis event and the introduction of the Monitor's character can bring some more oomph to these different shows. But unless the CW makes some radical changes to some of the style of storytelling when it comes to Supergirl and DC Legends of Tomorrow, I don't see how long those two shows are going to last. Supergirl may be number 4 in the ratings on the ratings list right now, but the precipitous drop from one year to the next, remember, again, I told you, the show has had over 2 million viewers in season 2, is now, for the first time, had under 1 million viewers for a season. That's a hard pill to swallow for any network, no matter how well that show is doing compared to other styles of programming. I don't mind the fact that the CW is invested in comic book television programming, but it doesn't mean that audiences are going to be that invested in it who maybe are not as diehard comic book and superhero and action programming style fans as they are. Remember, one of the reasons why Smallville lasted as long as it did wasn't because of the comic book fans. In fact, there was an intense amount of criticism about Smallville from comic book fans for many years for the style of storytelling and how they basically drew out the primitive years and the early years of Clark Kent turning into Superman. It was basically 10 years worth of Clark Kent not being Superman, basically, and that exasperated a lot of the comic book audience. But Smallville's strength wasn't the comic book audience. It was the fact that they drew in an audience that wasn't purely just comic book fans. They drew in a group of people who became diehard invested in the characters of the show, like Lex Luthor, Lana Lang, Chloe Sullivan, along with Clark Kent. People were invested in their characters' stories, and it just happened to be that he was Superman and he had powers, and you had these very bizarre situations they had to work through, but people were invested in the characters. And I think that's what the CW needs to focus on. They did a very good job with The Flash. They got better at that with the Arrow television show. They need to get back to that when it comes to Supergirl and DC Legends of Tomorrow, if they want to keep those shows running. And as I've told you before, Black Lightning, it got better in the ratings and audience reception as the season progressed because they invested in the core of the show, which is, it is a show built around the family of the Jeffersons and less about Black Lightning versus some supervillain like Tobias Wall. I think that's where the real value for that show is going to be, especially since it's basically a standalone show. It's very bizarre to have a superhero show that's not associated with other superhero shows. But for now, Black Lightning is doing okay in terms of their viewership. And like I said, they got better as the season progressed. Topic number 3 on this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Andre Iguodala, former 76er, NBA Finals MVP with the Warriors, recently told the media that Steph Curry, in his eyes, is the second greatest point guard in NBA history. And to a lot of people, this kind of expanded the conversation that has been made recently of how valuable and how talented Steph Curry is. Without Kevin Durant in the lineup, the Golden State Warriors enter the 2019 NBA Finals a whopping 30-1 when Kevin Durant is not on the floor and when Steph Curry is. The Warriors, over the last several years without Steph Curry, are 26-26 when he's not on the floor. Steph Curry's value to the Golden State Warriors is extensive. And despite the assumptions of many that Kevin Durant is one of the greatest players on the planet, his talent can now oversee the value of Steph Curry to this basketball team. And so, while it's understandable of all the praise that has been heaped on Steph Curry recently, say he's the number 2 point guard of all time is basically Andre Iguodala telling everybody that we are going to change what a point guard means. Steph Curry himself has admitted that one of his favorite players all time was Allen Iverson. Allen Iverson, by the definition of his style of play, and what traditionally the league has always been in terms of the point guard position, he himself is not a point guard. He was a small guard who was a scorer, but because of his size, he was boxed into the point guard position. Traditionally, point guard is the guy who runs the offense. He's the guy who oversees offense's function. He's also tends to be a guy who piles up a lot in the assist category, setting up his teammates, being a leader. You look back on NBA history, whether it's Magic Johnson, John Stockton, Oscar Robertson, Bob Cousy, and even come back to the modern day, point guards are usually the guy who is leading the offense. He's the captain on the floor. He calls out a lot of the players on offense and defense, and he's a major catalyst for how the offense runs. It wasn't until Phil Jackson came along with the triangle offense that teams started thinking outside the box more often when it came to the point guard position. Even when Isaiah Thomas was having his Hall of Fame career, yeah, he was a scoring point guard, but he was still the facilitator of the offense. Now, Isaiah Thomas's style of play set the groundwork for players like Allen Iverson, Stephon Marbury, Steve Francis, and others to come along and be more assertive scoring point guards. Still, guys like Chris Paul came along in the NBA and who were more of the traditional style. Chris Paul, Steve Nash, and others. Steph Curry was the next evolution in the growth of the point guard from being stereotyped. The NBA is growing more and more into a league that has multiple ball handlers on the court. Since the Detroit Pistons championship run in the late 1980s, the league has looked more and more to find multiple guys on the perimeter who can ball handle to allow offenses to basically outwork a defense. If the defense can't cue in on one scorer or one ball handler or one three-point shooter, it's easier for offenses to score more often like they are today, and it's harder for defenses to stop them. This is where basketball is different than football. In football, defense is essential typically to winning a championship. In basketball, the pure objective of the game is to outscore your opponent. And unless you have a team that has super elite athletes who have a super high IQ, traditionally, you just need to outscore your opponent. No matter how you have to do it, you just find a way. In basketball today, the reason why teams are scoring so much is because there's more than one ball handler. There's more than one perimeter scorer. There's more than one player who can do a specific skill. And because of that, that is where the growth of the game has been. And part of that evolution has been Steph Curry. I've always been a fan of Steph Curry when he was at Davidson. I loved watching him play. I loved his energy. I loved his enthusiasm. I thought he was a wizard when it came to scoring the basketball and shooting. And it was very frustrating for me to watch him when he came to the NBA and have the number of injuries that he suffered early in his career. It was a little disheartening, honestly. And then he finally got healthy. The Warriors started making the postseason, and then they started winning all these championships. And yes, Steph Curry in some ways has been overlooked because of the arrival of Kevin Durant. But at the same time, as part of Curry's greatness. Part of his greatness as a basketball player is the fact that he is willing to defer, that he is willing to pass the ball up, that he is not looking to just be a scorer. He can be more than a point guard or more than a scorer or more than any one thing as a basketball player. So in that way, Steph Curry is one of the greatest point guards of all time because he has not just evolved the game, he has changed the game. He has grown the game beyond a certain point. While Steph Curry is never going to be considered some great assist guy, he's currently 83rd all time in assists in NBA history, the fact that he is a high level as a defensive player is something that's going to elevate him. The fact that he is a great three-point shooter, an elite free throw shooter, and has a high scoring average for a player who is considered a point guard, the bigger number is the fact that he has won so many MVPs. While a lot of players have won championships, not every player is winning league MVPs like Steph Curry has. And his growing list of hardware, when he's only at the age of 31 years old, tells you that Steph Curry still has a lot of room to add to his resume. But to sit here and say he's the second greatest point guard of all time, I think is a disservice by Andre Iguodala because, one, Steph Curry is more than just a point guard. Just like Magic Johnson was more than just a point guard himself. The point guard position has evolved to a point where most people criticize players like Ben Simmons if they're not able to do certain things like Steph Curry does. The greater impact of Steph Curry is not the fact that he's a point guard, it's the fact that he has evolved the NBA to a level that we never expected. When we watched Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars have a backcourt that had not one but two ball handlers, two guys who could score, two guys who could run an offense, it was a game changer for the league in that style of play. Even when Magic was winning championships in the 1980s, it's not like Byron Scott or Michael Cooper or any of the other players who played in the backcourt with Magic were in any way as fluid of a ball handler as he was. And now we have the next ridiculous part of the evolution, which is Draymond Green is the number 2 ball handler on the team, and he is, the power forward of the basketball team, I guess. The real function is that the NBA has evolved beyond positions. There is no more traditional point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, and center. Steph Curry is not a point guard. He's a weapon. He's an offensive phenom. He's an underrated defender. He is one of the greatest threats to score in the league today. And while James Harden gets a lot of accolades because he had a phenomenal year statistically, at the end of the day, when push came to shove, it was Steph Curry who went bonkers at the end of that Game 6 versus the Rockets and carried his team to a series win, while James Harden didn't score for roughly 8 minutes. It's Steph Curry that, when push came to shove, is always willing to take the final shot. But he's also the same one who's willing to defer when his teammates like Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, and others are having hot games. When Draymond Green had 18 points, 11 rebounds, 11 assists in the first 3 quarters, Steph Curry deferred to him because he was on fire. But what did Steph do? When his team needed him, he stepped up. He's not a point guard. To say he's the second greatest point guard of all time is actually confining what he has done as a basketball player. Winning 2 NBA championships, winning a scoring title, a 6-time All-Star, a 1-time Steals champion, 6-time All-NBA teams. His NBA career goes beyond his position. Like the other great players who have preceded him, who have changed how we looked at the game of basketball, whether it's Magic Johnson, Isaiah Thomas, Michael Jordan, Shaquille O'Neal, all of these players defied their position. They were more than just a center, a point guard, a shooting guard. Michael Jordan is considered the greatest player of all time, not just the greatest shooting guard of all time. And I think Steph Curry, if he continues the level of success that he has and he can stay healthy for another 5 to 6 years of elite play, he's not going to be considered just a great point guard anymore. He's going to make a conversation for being one of the 10 greatest players of all time. Andre Iguodala can say that he's the second greatest point guard, but I'm going to tell you that Steph Curry's greatness goes beyond his position. He's changed the game forever. That is real greatness, and that makes him second to none. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm Josh Hennig, your host. I bring you my perspectives on the worlds of sports and comic movies and TV shows each and every episode. If you like the content that we had today, drop your comments and thoughts in the section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time right here for the Mutant Blitz Podcast.